What's up, everybody? Miss Mang here. Welcome to Communication Studies class, Public Speaking Edition. Today we're going to be talking about language. So a lot of you may wonder, why do we have a lecture about language in public speaking class? And that, my dears, is a very easy answer, and that is that you are using language when you are creating your speeches and developing your ideas. So it's important to really think about language when it comes to writing or developing your speeches that you're going to give. So the first thing that you may ask is it communication and language the same thing? Well, I'm here to tell you that the answer to that is absolutely not. Communication and language are two separate things. So communication is the act of interacting and sending and receiving messages, and language is what we use to be able to create and evolve those messages to be able to send them, encode them, and decode them. Language creates social reality and is culturally transmitted. So in order for us to understand what each thing that we interact with or all the different things in our world, we have to have language connected to it in order for us to have actual meaning. So for example, if I was to pick up this phone, you know that it's a phone because you've tied the language, the word phone, to this phone. But if we didn't have a word for phone, we would just be like, this thing, like without having language, we can't actually communicate what this thing is. So language is vital for communicating, and also it helps us to understand our reality and communicate our reality to other people around us. Different cultures use different language and different terms. If you've ever thought like, oh, why is it that people on the East Coast call it pop and we call it soda on the West Coast? That is a cultural difference when it comes to language. Think in your head of things that like you understand because you're from California or because you're from a certain area, you have a certain culture that other people just don't understand because they're not from that culture. All of that goes down to language. So language is really important because it is creating our social reality. It creates and it helps us to be able to communicate our culture to other people, to pass down our culture, and to build up our culture together. It's very important while constructing messages to be as clear as possible. And there are quite a few ways to do this, but here are a couple. The first one is not to be fake. So you should do your best to be, when you are writing your speech, as upfront and real as possible. Because audiences can sense when you're being fake. Have you ever had a friend or someone come up to you and be like, oh my gosh, you're so pretty, or like, you're so amazing, and you can tell that they're being fake with you? Well, audiences have that same idea. For example, whenever a student asks me a question and I don't actually know the answer to that question, I will say, I don't know, let me look it up and I'll get back to you next class. So that creates a rapport between you and I as the student and the teacher. That way you understand better, like, oh, okay, my teacher is a person. They know a lot of things, but maybe they don't know everything. And so they sometimes need to go and reference something in order to teach us the correct thing. And audiences appreciate that because it builds more credibility with you as the speaker. The next thing is jargon. Jargon is language that we use, different words that small groups or cultures specifically understand. For example, this is very, very prominent in the workplace. So if you were at a plumbing convention and they were talking about all these different plumbing terms, those terms themselves count as jargon. If you were in a public speaking class and you were talking to your classmate, you were like, blah, 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 communication apprehension and cognitive dissonance and systematic desensitization, all of those words, those all count as jargon. Now, the difference between jargon and slang, which is something that people often get confused, is that jargon is more formal and slang is more casual. So you may be familiar with lots of slang that like you and your friends use. Maybe you say LMAO in your regular life. That counts as slang because different cultures might not understand that. Also, you may do things that reference certain cultural experiences or cultural icons that only within a certain culture would you understand that. So for example, if you're referring to TikTok and you're talking about the renegade, that could end up falling under the term of slang because maybe someone who's older might not know what you're talking about. The other thing that you want to avoid when it comes to constructing clear messages is cliches. So you've all heard cliches before. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The grass is always greener on the other side. Or actions speak louder than words. These cliches tend to be a not as powerful way to communicate what you're actually trying to communicate with your words. So you want to create clear messages while you're public speaking. And one way to do that is to not be fake, to avoid jargon and avoid slang, and also to avoid cliches. The reason why we do this is because we don't want to isolate anyone in our audience. So there's a chance that your audience might not understand your cliche, or they might not get what you're talking about when you're using jargon. And so you're going to want to make everyone feel as welcomed and make everyone understand what you're talking about. That is your goal as the public speaker, to help your audience to get your message. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of stylized language. So this is gonna feel a little bit like an English class for a second, but that's okay. It's a nice refresher. You can use these different types of language when you are creating your speech. The first one is metaphor. A metaphor is when you compare two separate things that have similar characteristics but are otherwise unrelated. For example, when you say, oh, my brother is the black sheep of the family, you're comparing brother and black sheep, and really they might not be related at all, but they have these similar characteristics that's prompting you to compare the two. Her smile lights up the room. You're comparing someone's smile to a lamp. The next one is simile. Simile is when you're comparing two things using the words like or as. So I was as hungry as a dinosaur. I am sparkling like the night sky. Or she was running to class as fast as a cheetah. All of these things are similes. The next one is alliteration. Alliteration is when you use the first letter repeatedly again. So if you think of like vocal warm-ups that we've done in class, they start with the same letter and it's again and again. For example, she sells seashells by the seashore. So repeating using that first letter or that first sound being the same is alliteration. All right, now that we're done with our little English class, let's talk about ethical language use. So now we're going to talk about sexist language. Sexist language in general is language that specifically identifies gender when it is unnecessary. So we should avoid using sexist language because whenever you identify and really point out one, you're separating the rest and isolating all the audience members that aren't that specific gender. One type of this language to avoid is man-linked terms. So think of any word that you've ever heard that ends with the word man. So policeman, fireman, mailman, and replace those with gender neutral terms. So police officer or male person or firefighter. That way you're not isolating and saying like, oh, only men can be in this particular career or this group of people. The next thing to avoid is spotlighting. Now, spotlighting is when you take a term that is gender neutral, but you attach a gender to it because we as a culture are used to that specific term being connected to a certain gender. So for example, when you say a male nurse, like a nurse is already a gender neutral term. It could be female, male, non-binary, etc. But we're used to it being connected to females. And so we spotlight the fact that it's a male nurse. Or like when you hear people say a female doctor, like any doctor could be male or female. You should just refer to them as doctor. The final thing is heterosexist language. So heterosexist language essentially just assumes that everyone is straight and not gay or queer or anything like that. So having language that assumes that the world is man and woman together is harmful because it isolates, again, part of your audience. So all of these things that we're doing is we're working to make our language the most acceptable for the most people so that our message reaches the most people. The number one thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to offend one of your audience members because of a language choice that you made that you just didn't think through. So that's the reason why we're talking about this today, is because it's really important to take that extra time and consider the words and the language that we are using when we are creating our speeches or communicating with other people. Finally, here are some language pitfalls that we should avoid while making speeches. The first one is using profanity. You should do your best not to use profanity when you're speaking, and that's because even if you're fine with profanity and you know that your friends in the class are fine with profanity, it doesn't mean that everyone in the room is actually okay with profanity. When you use profanity, you are using a derogatory term often, and even if you don't see it that way, other people might be offended by it or might see that as an offensive term. And so you should prevent yourself from using it because it doesn't help your argument. For example, in class, I will not cuss. Like, I'm not going to cuss because I know that I might have students that don't like cussing, and it will put a barrier between them and learning when I use cuss words. So even if I cuss in my normal life, I won't cuss in the classroom because I know that it will stop people from learning. And that's the opposite of my goal. The next thing is to be very careful of your use of exaggeration. So even when you're using stories that are an exaggeration as like a learning tool, it might be more harmful than positive. You can use it, but if you're over-exaggerating or if you're exaggerating often, then you're going to end up losing credibility, and that's the last thing that you want. Okay, so this one is really important for public speaking, and that is, I want you to stop using powerless language. This is very important for persuasive speaking particularly. You should not be using language that is, we may be able to do this, or we might change, or this could be a problem. You should be firm in your claims and your ideas, particularly because you've researched this speech and you've really created an argument that you should be proud of. So you should take out all of those words. By the way, those words are called hedging. So saying we might, or we could, or this may be a problem, or we may be able to fix it is hedging. It's protecting yourself from standing behind the actual claim that you are trying to make. So don't hedge. And the last thing that I'm going to say not to do is don't use disclaimers. Now, I know it's very hard. I know that like you've woken up the day of your speech and you thought, oh crap, like I'm sick, or oh no, like I didn't eat this morning, now I'm super hungry, I'm not gonna have enough energy, or I am struggling with like speech anxiety, or I'm really cold in this classroom, or I didn't prepare as much as I thought, and you're gonna want to say those things to the class or say those things before you start speaking, but you should not do that. So preventing yourself from making those disclaimers will make you appear stronger as a speaker, and chances are high that the people in the audience don't know that, and they're not going to judge you differently if they even see symptoms of that. But if you get up there and you say, oh, hey, like I just wrote this last night, automatically the audience is going to be, why are you wasting our time? And you don't want that. You don't want the audience to have preconceived notions that you should be judged by them in a way that they never would have before, just because of something you said. So things not to do. Don't use disclaimers. I want you to stand behind your claims. And I want you to make sure that you are choosing language that does not create borders or boundaries between you and your audience. This whole lecture is all about that. Choosing language that will relate to your audience and not create distance between you and them. All right, that's language. I hope you enjoyed learning about language, and I will see you next time. Miss Mang,